Alright guys, how's it going? It's been a hectic month on the tech front, with news, leaks and reveals coming from every direction. We now have a pretty good idea of what Intel's Raptor Lake and AMD's Zen 4 will bring to the CPU war, but I think most of you will agree that currently the graphics market is the far more interesting talking point. As has been the case for the last few generations, it looks like Nvidia will be first out of the gate again. Remember, going back that wasn't always the case, and in fact it rarely was the case as AMD and ATI before them generally released the next generation, anything between a few weeks to 6 months, in the case of Fermi, ahead of Nvidia. But that all changed with Pascal, and since then Nvidia has been a bit ahead of AMD's release schedule. That's an interesting talking point that I'll touch on briefly later. But given Nvidia are ahead, and given Nvidia's product launches are usually filled with drama, I think it's fair to cover them first, and their new incoming Lovelace RTX 40 series of cards. So let's start with the new architecture. If you recall a video I made during the Ampere launch, this one on Nvidia's CUDA Core Evolution, I explained how Ampere's architecture had changed from Turing, with the major difference being how Nvidia combined FP32 and Int32 inside of the SM. This was different from Turing, where we can see separate FP32 and Int32. And what this meant was the apparently huge increase in FP32 CUDA core count wasn't reflected on Ampere's performance increase, because the chip could only partially do FP32 and Int32 concurrently. At the end of this video, I said that I guarantee that this FP32 Int32 sharing problem will go away with the next generation. In other words, I expected them to go back to a similar architecture as Turing, with separate data paths, but I was wrong about that. And if we compare Lovelace over here at the right to Ampere on the left, we can see that very little appears to have changed at the streaming multiprocessor level. We still have the combined FP32 and Int32, and the separate FP32, but now we have what looks like a much larger, much beefier tensor core in Lovelace, but literally everything else appears to have stayed the same. However, as soon as you take a peek outside of the SM, we can instantly see where the major change in Lovelace is. While Ampere only had 6 megabytes of L2 cache shared amongst all the cores, Lovelace has a massive 96 megabytes of L2, 16 times more L2 cache. Now obviously AMD started these huge GPU caches with their 128 megabyte Infinity cache, which is actually more like an L3 cache rather than L2. And apparently even Intel have bought into the idea that more cache was the way forward, with their high-end Arc GPUs rumoured to contain 112 megabytes. You can pretty much figure out that if all three companies are going this way, they're doing it for a reason. And the whole point of these huge caches is to lessen bandwidth and latency requirements between the chip and the VRAM. And it is also very useful for ray tracing, which goes a long way towards explaining Nvidia's decision to hop on board as well. So let's take a look at Lovelace's specifications over at Tom's Hardware, who compiled this chart, where Nvidia's ADA specifications are compared versus Ampere. Nvidia so far has announced 3 different cards with 3 different GPUs. The big change regarding manufacturing is the use of TSMC's 4nm node, which is actually just a small enhancement of their 5nm node that AMD will be using. However, compared to Ampere's lethargic 8nm node, which Ampere used, and remember this was a small enhancement of Samsung's 10nm node, the difference between these two nodes should be huge. And we can easily see that by comparing the transistor count, which one would normally expect to maybe double generation to generation, but in fact, Nvidia has increased transistor count from 28.3 billion in the Ampere GA102 to 76.3 billion transistors in AD102. That is a massive 2.7 times increase. However, as I just mentioned, Lovelace has a huge L2 cache comparatively, which explains a lot of that transistor increase. Now you might not realise this, but cache is much denser than logic. It is somewhere between 3 and 5 times as dense, so you can cram far more cache into the same die area. Regarding die sizes, the new Lovelace chip is still very large at 608 square millimeters, but that is slightly down on Ampere's GA102, which was 628.4 square millimeters. But make no mistake about it, this is still a very, very large chip. Now, comparing the shader count though, the AD102 chip contains a maximum of 18,432 CUDA cores. However, the RTX 4090 current flagship, and yes, there will be a 4090 Ti later on, this is slightly cut down on the main chip, containing only 16,384 shaders, which is a drop of 11%. Nvidia's outgoing 3090 Ti contains 10,752 shaders, so the increase in core count from Ampere to the Lovelace RTX 4090 is 52%. Now, Nvidia is claiming that the RTX 4090 will have more than double the shader teraflops compared to the 3090 Ti. And obviously, given that we know Lovelace only has 52% more shaders, the rest of this increase must be coming from clock speed, which is obviously 2.52 GHz. So everything else being equal, one would expect a roughly 2 times performance increase from generation to generation. And in fact, Jensen Huang at the recent GTC was keen to point out that 2 times figure, or 4 times, up to 4 times with ray tracing and DLSS3. But the benchmarks that we saw didn't quite reach that heady height. And this was the benchmark shown. And we can see the difference between what Nvidia calls today's games and next generation, even though the next generation includes a game from 2007, Portal, and one which launched last year. Now, drawing a line between 1.5x and 2x gives us the 75% faster mark. And in closer inspection, running today's games, the performance seems quite far removed from 2 times. Resident Evil Village, that looks about 73% faster. The light green is the 4090, with the grey being the 3090 Ti. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, that only looks about 49% faster. And in The Division 2, that looks to be around about 65% faster, which would give us an average increase of around 62%. Now, there is a much larger increase with the final 2 games. However, looking at the chart at the bottom, it's a little bit blurry, but we can see that Nvidia has used DLSS and the new DLSS 3 frame generation when applicable on the 40 series cards. These 2 here, not apples to apples comparisons. And essentially, the first 3 results here is what give us a real indication of expected performance in games that don't explicitly utilise the 40 series. Now, I reckon there'll maybe be 65% to 75% overall in rasterization, which is nothing to turn your nose up at. That is a very good increase in performance. Looking at this next generation stuff, this is essentially the kind of performance increase you expect to see when games are specifically built around the new architecture. And really, you have to wait and see if this is true. Time will tell. But like I said, it's a good increase in performance. But at what cost? It's been long rumoured that this upcoming generation would put a serious strain on your power supply, with some crazy numbers doing the rounds on Twitter. But with this graph, it appears that rumours of 450 watts were on target. And only Nvidia could claim this as being power efficient, with this graph showing just how much better in performance per watt Lovelace is when you use the new technologies that Ampere doesn't have. And also, please note that when Ampere launched, Jensen made this same 2x performance per watt claim over Turing. However, looking at this chart now, it's difficult to see how this gap here between Turing and Ampere, how can this be 2x more efficient when this one is 2x more efficient? This is just marketing crap. What's actually important here is just how much power the new technologies use. The RTX 40 series has a bunch of new stuff for ray tracing and DLSS, and it may well be the case that 450 watts is only reached when the entire card is being utilised. And if you remember way back to the asynchronous compute days, remember that? When AMD had it and Nvidia didn't have it, there was a pretty hefty power cost involved in games that utilised async compute. I tested it with Doom, and I was taken aback at just how much power my old RX 480 started to pull during that game. If this isn't the case here with Lovelace though, And if this 450 watts is fairly typical of average gaming power in rasterized games, then the performance per watt uplift from Ampere must be pretty mediocre. And this would be pretty surprising to me, as I would have expected Nvidia to hit maybe 70% performance at the same power as Ampere, not 70% more performance at 30% higher power. Remember, this is TSMC's 4nm versus Samsung's 8nm. The power savings should have been enormous. That point brings me to a slight tangent, and the news last week that EVGA, one of Nvidia's premier partners, had finally given up on their Nvidia partnership. Nobody who watched my Nvidia anti-competitive and Nvidia's GeForce Partner Program videos would have been remotely surprised. This is just Nvidia being Nvidia. And at the end of this GPP video, I laid it out flat to Nvidia's partners that unless they have an idea to put the brakes on Nvidia's shenanigans, things will just get worse for them over time. EVGA have long been seen as the premier partner for Nvidia, and were a very popular choice for Nvidia buyers, especially in America. But their CEO, Andrew Han, has clearly had enough of being squeezed by Nvidia every new generation. And he commented over at Gamers Nexus that we being EVGA, are not going to be on Jensen Huang's lap on stage, so I don't want people to speculate what's going on when they're not there. And he said, EVGA have decided not to carry the next gen. EVGA is continuing the current product line, and we will continue with the current generation until we run out. Now, that alone is a pretty strong statement. Being on Nvidia's lap. That sounds more like a dog than a partner. But anyway, he continued with, EVGA were routinely not informed of the product or cost of the product it would be manufacturing until Nvidia publicly announced the details. And they also apparently did not agree with Nvidia's lower pricing of its Founder Edition cards, which they felt undercut EVGA in the market. Now, I mentioned this problem for Nvidia's partners way back when the Founders Edition first launched, and I warned them that this would simply eat into their margins as time went on. Think about it. Nvidia designs the chips. They know exactly what size, how much power, etc. of their own chips. Obviously, that means that they have all the time in the world to get these Founders Edition coolers ready for their launch. But their partners don't get any of that information until Nvidia makes it public domain. Now think about this generation in particular, and its massive 450 watt demands on cooling. Ordinary cooling simply will not cut it here. Nothing we've seen before will. And that's why we're now seeing these images of triple slot solutions for Nvidia's own Founder Edition cards. And finally, think about this. Nvidia designs the chips, they get them back from TSMC, they can cherry pick the very best ones that they can find in terms of performance per watt, and they can stick them all in their own Founders Edition cards. And their partners are left with whatever chips Nvidia sees fit to give them. And then they have to somehow design a cooling system fit for these cards within weeks, only to find that they can't compete with Nvidia's Founders Edition prices anyway. I said at the beginning of this video that I'd talk about the reasons for why Nvidia is always first to market now. And this is why. Nvidia knows that their fan base will be clamouring to get their hands on these 4090s, or even one of these 4080s. And yes, I'll get to that point in a minute. I guarantee you that supply will be absolutely awful for months. It always is these days. And this is why. Very, very low volume cards that only Nvidia can realistically sell in any kind of volume. Cut out the middleman, take all the profit for yourself. I warned these guys years ago that this is what would happen. The instant I caught wind of this Founders Edition bullshit, I knew exactly what it spelled for these guys. And I told them. And had EVGA listened, they wouldn't be in this situation today. A situation where their GPU sales are apparently 78% of their gross revenue. Yet they now find themselves in a situation where they can't afford to make Nvidia graphics cards any longer. When asked about Andrew Han's comments about Nvidia treating their partners disrespectfully, Jensen Huang, Nvidia CEO, responded with, "The market has a lot of great players and it will be served well after EVGA," before saying EVGA were great partners and it was sad to see them leave the market. It doesn't matter who you are. Nvidia's idea of partnership only lasts as long as it suits Nvidia, and not a day longer. And this chart over at John Peddy says it all. Nvidia's margins continue to rise, while the partners continue to fall. And just to finish this part, only a few days ago Huang said, "The idea that the chip is going to go down in price is a story of the past, and Moore's Law is dead. A 12-inch wafer is a lot more expensive today." But what he didn't mention was that at Nvidia's Investor Day, their VP of Gaming was happily boasting about how revenue had increased due to price increases. And in fact, Nvidia's gaming revenue increased by a massive 61% last year. And yes, a 12-inch wafer is certainly more expensive today, but Nvidia still somehow seem to make more and more money every year. I wonder how they do that. Well, it's simple. The increasing wafer costs are nowhere near the increase in pricing every generation. But anyway, I am not going to blame Nvidia for being Nvidia. Everybody knows what they're like, including their partners. I have zero sympathy for EVGA, but I do hope that either AMD or Intel are in talks with them. I'd be quite surprised if they weren't, because both would be getting a big name partner who have a good track record of making excellent cooling solutions, as well as a loyal fan base. It would be crazy if either company wasn't already in talks with EVGA. Right, I've already discussed the 4090, and we have a fair idea of where its performance and power will land. The remaining two cards revealed were both RTX 4080s, and if you recall at the beginning of the video I said Nvidia has so far announced 3 cards and 3 different GPUs for Lovelace. So this top card, obviously the 4090, that was AD102, the biggest chip. But the 2 RTX 4080s, 2 different chips? You guys already know the history. Up until Fermi launched in 2009, the very best chip that Nvidia could manufacture was given the X80 class name. For example, the GTX 280, the GTX 480, the GTX 580. Those are all Nvidia's very best chips, the very best effort. But then Kepler launched, and Nvidia made the choice to launch their GTX 680 using their mid-range GK104 chip, saving their largest chip for the GTX 780, which launched a year later. The fanboys didn't care, they bought the 680 in droves anyway. Then Maxwell launched. The GTX 980 was the mid-range GM204 chip, on an old process as well. By that point, 28nm was ancient. Then Pascal launched. It was absolutely Maxwell on speed, and again the mid-range GP104 was branded as the GTX 1080. And then Turing launched. The RTX 2080 was TU104, the mid-range chip. And what's more, around about a year later when they launched the RTX 2070 Super, that also used the same TU104 chip. Ampere launched, and bizarrely Nvidia had decided to go back to their old scheme. The RTX 3080 actually used their top gaming chip at least, GA102. But this was simply due to how cheap and how old Samsung's 8nm node was. And the RTX 3080 was a heavily cut down large chip. But now with Lovelace, they've gone in the totally opposite direction. The RTX 4080 16GB is its own chip, AD103, which is new, the 103 number. It is much, much smaller than AD102, being 378.6 square millimeters. It is slightly cut down, with the full chip having 10,240 CUDA cores, and the RTX 4080 16GB having 9,728, which is a 5% drop. Analysing that, it's pretty clear that the future 4080 Ti will not utilise this chip. The 4080 Ti will almost certainly utilise a heavily cut down version of AD102. If we do see the full AD103 chip, Nvidia are likely to badge it as the 5070 Ti or 5070 Super sometime later next year. You can already see the marketing. Faster than the RTX 4080, 16GB. It will be the same chip, but this time not cut down, and it will have a slight clock speed bump. And that brings us to the last card, the RTX 4080 12GB. And the chip is AD104. It is very crafty of Nvidia to retain the 04 codename, simply by adding an AD103 chip. But let's be honest, nobody fell for it. AD104 is 294.5 square millimeters, and it is the smallest x80 class chip Nvidia has made since the GTX 680 over 10 years ago, which incidentally was also 294 square millimeters. This has upset a lot of people, and I think a lot of the reason for that is the card only has a 192-bit memory bus, which feels like the equivalent of a 64-bit bus from a few years ago. But remember, that much larger L2 cache is supposed to mitigate that. Nvidia could have had a 256 bus and less cache in that same 294 square millimeter chip, but the architecture has moved on, and Nvidia believes that their focus on ray tracing means more cache is better overall. I dislike this chip intensely because it's the fourth chip. Back in the days, the 280, the 480, the 580, they were all Nvidia's best effort. And you got that for a premium back then, which was generally around the $500 mark. Today, you get Nvidia's fourth best effort for $900. This is simply Nvidia being Nvidia, and I don't know how many times I've said this, but I guess I'll say it again. If you reward Nvidia for creating this aberration of a card, then you get everything you deserve next time as well. That's you, the Nvidia buyer, who spent $370 on a GTX 1070 and will now have to spend $900 for the same level of card. The 1070 was a larger chip, by the way, and it had a 256-bit memory bus. They say a picture paints 1,000 words. Well, this script is 3,334 words long, and here are a couple of charts showing exactly how awful this 480 12GB is. On a simple metric of cost per chip size. And yes, I realise wafer costs continue to rise over the years, but this is simply a reflection of what you were getting in the past versus what you get today. Before Lovelace, on average you paid $1.13 per square millimetre, but with the RTX 4080 12GB, you are paying almost 3 times that amount. And note also, the 2 times in the past where Nvidia's revenue and profits exploded, the GTX 680, the GTX 1080, both times that they used their mid-range GPU, on a new node, they made a fortune. Well, now they intend to make even more of a fortune. And look, I'm well aware that some of you are thinking, well Jim, nobody buys a graphics card based on the size of the chip. That's correct, nobody does. But this second chart will show you why you should never buy based on branding either. Every single x80 class GPU ever built was faster than the previous generation flagship. The GTX 480 was 54% faster than the GTX 280. The 580, which was simply a fixed 480, was 15% faster than that card. The 680, even though it was a mid-range chip, it still beat the 580 flagship by 23%. The 780, which should have been the real flagship instead of the 680, that still beat the 680 by 20%. The GTX 980 beat the 780 Ti, Nvidia's entire GK100 chip, their real flagship, by 8%. The GTX 1080, that beat the 980 Ti by a huge 37%. Nvidia really messed up there. I bet they are wishing they had branded this as a 1080 Ti at $1,000 instead. Even the RTX 2080 beat the 1080 Ti by 9%. And that was including all that ray tracing stuff, by the way. And then the RTX 3080 beat the 2080 Ti by 23%. But now, for the first time in history, Nvidia's X80 class card, the GTX 480 12GB, loses to the previous generation flagship, the 3090 Ti, by around 10%. Based on the dark green bars here, compared to the grey 3090 Ti, it just about equals it in Division 2, but loses in the previous 2 games. And this stuff here simply does not count. You can swallow this crap all you want about DLSS 3 in a handful of games, and even ray tracing if you want. Just be sure that in no way, shape or form have you bought an X80 class GPU with the 4080 12GB. I really would love to see the tech press give this garbage 1 star, but we already know they won't give it less than 3. Some will even give it 4 stars out of 5. Right, that's enough of this. I was going to talk about Intel and AMD in this video as well, but yeah, it's long enough already. So that will come soon. AMD especially has piqued my interest in chiplets again, and I want to do a highly speculative and obviously risky, for that matter, video on what we might expect from them. I'll catch you later, guys.